First story, the vanishing cabin. The Appalachian Trail is no joke. My friends, Jeff, Maya, and I had been planning this hike for months. Our way of unwinding from city life and work stress. We picked late October, when the leaves were at their most vivid but the trail was quiet. The towns near the stretch we were hiking were sparse and signal was patchy, but that was part of the appeal. About 4 days into our hike, we decided to veer slightly off the trail, lured by the chance to explore an untouched part of the forest. That's when we spotted it. An old, dark wooden cabin nestled at the bottom of a small valley. Its weathered frame and leaning structure made it look like it had been forgotten long ago. Jeff pulled out his map, squinting in the fading light. "This isn't marked anywhere," he muttered. None of us could find any mention of it on our maps or the app we downloaded. But it was getting cold, and the thought of setting up camp indoors was appealing. We shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was a hunter's cabin or some long-abandoned shelter. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, tinged with the scent of wet wood and something faintly metallic. Dust coated everything, and the sparse furniture was buried under sheets of grime. There was a single table and a couple of chairs, an old fireplace, and a small cot in the corner. We decided it was good enough, though, and set up our gear, setting our flashlights and headlamps in the center of the room to push back the thick shadows. We were just getting settled when the sound started. At first, it was subtle branches snapping, a soft crunch of leaves, like footsteps coming closer. We all paused, sharing a look as the noise stopped. Jeff went to the window, peering into the darkness. "Nothing out there," he said, but his voice sounded uneasy. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The silence was so deep it almost felt unnatural, as though something was holding its breath, just waiting. Maya tried to laugh it off. "Probably a raccoon or something," she said, though her eyes didn't meet ours. But as the night went on, the sounds grew louder, heavier. The footsteps circled the cabin, pausing in a rhythm that felt too human to dismiss. At one point, Jeff claimed he saw something, a shape just outside the window ducking out of sight. We all jumped up, rushing to the window, but saw nothing except the silhouettes of trees against the moonlight. Jeff swore up and down that he had seen someone, that the shadow had been too tall, too solid, to be anything other than a person. Just as we were starting to calm down, there was a loud creak from the door. It opened slightly, just enough to make the beam of Maya's flashlight catch on something, what looked like fingers gripping the doorframe. But as soon as we pointed our lights, the door swung shut with a hollow bang. None of us could sleep after that. Every time we tried to settle down, more noises would start. The shuffling of feet, whispers we couldn't quite make out. Around 4 a.m., when the cabin felt unbearably suffocating, we made a decision. At first light, we'd pack up and leave. When dawn finally broke, we were out of there faster than I thought possible. None of us spoke much as we made our way back to the main trail, all of us occasionally glancing back over our shoulders, expecting to see someone, something. Back in town, we stopped by a small diner to get some real food and try to shake off the lingering chill. The waitress noticed our hiking gear and struck up a conversation. "Didn't see many people up there this time of year," she said, refilling our coffee. We mentioned the cabin, mostly to ease our nerves, expecting her to know something about it. But her face paled. "You sure?" she asked, looking around as if making sure no one else could hear. "There hasn't been a cabin up there for, well, since before my time, at least 50 years. Apparently, there used to be an old hunting cabin in that area, but it had been torn down decades ago after a tragedy. Some crime no one in town liked to talk about. A murder, maybe. No one could say for sure, but people had sworn over the years that the cabin sometimes appeared to people hiking off-trail, only to vanish again by morning." Jeff, Maya, and I didn't waste any time. We went straight to the nearest ranger station and asked if someone could check the place out. A couple of rangers came with us, though they seemed skeptical. When we reached the spot where the cabin had been, we were met with only a clearing. Just a wide, empty space surrounded by trees. There wasn't a single trace of the cabin we had spent the night in. No foundation, no wood scraps, not even a trail leading up to where it had stood. The rangers gave us odd looks as we tried to explain, but after a while, they just shook their heads, muttering about imaginations running wild in the mountains. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but when I'm alone at night, I sometimes hear the sounds of footsteps in the dark, circling, pausing, waiting, and I wonder if we ever really left that cabin, or if some part of us is still there, trapped in the silence, in that place that shouldn't exist. Second story, the call of Silent Valley. I'd hiked the Appalachian Trail many times, often alone, always looking for the stretches that tested my endurance, places where solitude felt almost supernatural. But nothing ever unsettled me quite like that night in Silent Valley. I'd heard the stories, of course. Locals warned hikers about this one particular stretch, whispering about the ones who didn't come back, the sounds people heard late at night, like the faint, distant cries of something or someone. A few superstitious hikers claimed that Silent Valley itself had some old curse on it, but I dismissed it as folklore. Maybe that was my first mistake. I arrived at the valley at dusk. The forest was eerily quiet, and the silence grew thick as I set up my small camp just off the trail. As night fell, I built a modest fire and listened to the wind rustling through the trees. But soon, even the wind died down, and there was nothing but the absolute stillness of the woods around me. It was as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it, a faint sound, drifting in on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the breeze, but it grew clearer, and my heart sank as I realized it sounded like crying. A child, maybe, or a woman, far off in the valley, just loud enough to make out, but so faint it almost blended with the night air. Curiosity gnawed at me. I tried to push the sound from my mind, but it grew louder, rising and falling with the wind, almost like it was calling to me. Against every instinct, I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my boots, and headed toward the sound, leaving my fire behind. As I descended into the valley, the crying grew louder, and the air turned cold, the kind of chill that seeps deep into your bones. My flashlight cut through the dark, casting long shadows across the trees. After what felt like an hour, I stumbled upon what looked like an old campsite nestled between some rocks. A small clearing where an abandoned tent stood half-collapsed, its fabric frayed and faded. Clothes were scattered around, jackets, shoes, even a small teddy bear. I felt a strange pang of sadness as I scanned the site. A can of soup lay nearby, unopened, next to a fire ring still partially intact, with blackened wood that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. And yet, everything seemed fresh. The tent's interior had sleeping bags, carefully rolled up, almost as if someone had left in a hurry but planned to come back. The crying sound echoed again, this time louder, and I realized it was coming from deeper within the valley. Against my better judgment, I turned toward it, feeling an overwhelming need to follow. But the further I walked, the more the valley seemed to close in on me, the trees pressing closer, the air growing heavier. The sound was clearer now, like someone in terrible pain, but as soon as I moved toward it, it would fade, drifting back into the night. I stopped, heart pounding, the weight of the silence bearing down on me. That's when I saw it. A small wooden sign, half buried in the dirt, nearly obscured by a thick layer of moss and dead leaves. I brushed it off, squinting in the dim light. Warning, danger of avalanches. No trespassing beyond this point. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I'd crossed into restricted territory. I turned to go back, and that's when the crying stopped. The silence was immediate, suffocating, as if the valley itself had swallowed the sound whole. A sudden fear gripped me, and I rushed back toward my camp, not daring to look behind me, feeling as though the very shadows were watching, waiting. When I reached my tent, the fire had burned down to embers, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there, staring into the darkness, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. At dawn, I packed up and hiked straight to the ranger station, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. I told one of the rangers, an older man named Cliff, about the abandoned camp and the strange sounds, hoping he'd have an explanation. But as soon as I mentioned Silent Valley, his face grew grim. "You're sure you saw a camp down there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but Cliff just shook his head. "We searched that area last spring. No sign of anything like that," he said. "It's restricted for a reason. People go missing there, too many over the years." I tried to insist, telling him exactly where I'd seen the abandoned tent and the scattered belongings. But when he and a team of rangers went out to check, they found nothing. No tent, no clothes, nothing. Just untouched forest. A week later, I was back in town and overheard a group of hikers talking about Silent Valley. They mentioned the crying woman, a legend I'd heard growing up but had never believed. According to them, others had followed the sound before, only to vanish without a trace. They said it was the valley calling, pulling people in, that it needed company. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was all just superstition, a trick of my mind from the isolation. But even now, I can still hear that faint, distant crying when the night is still, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that the valley is waiting, calling for someone to join the silence once again. Third story, Whispers in the Mist. Tom and I had been together for a year, and as two hiking enthusiasts, we wanted to mark the occasion with something unforgettable. The Appalachian Trail, with its winding paths and wild beauty, felt like the perfect challenge. We'd planned everything down to the last detail. The supplies, the rest points, even the exact spot we'd set up camp each night. The trail held a kind of mystery that called to both of us, and we were eager to be out there in nature, just the two of us. Our second day on the trail, the weather took a turn. It had been clear that morning, but by the afternoon, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, veiling everything in a ghostly gray. It was the kind of fog that didn't drift in from afar. It just appeared, suddenly swallowing the trail. Within minutes, we couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. "Let's wait it out," Tom suggested, shrugging. It wasn't a big deal to him, just a hiccup in the plan. We decided to sit by the side of the trail, hoping the fog would lift soon. As we sat there, though, something felt wrong. The silence around us became heavy, as though the trees were listening. Then, faintly at first, I heard it, a soft whisper, like someone murmuring just behind us. I whipped my head around, expecting to see someone there, but it was just us and the trees, still as statues in the mist. "Did you hear that?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Tom chuckled, trying to shake off the tension. "It's probably just the wind," but a minute later, we both heard it again. Closer this time and clearer. A raspy voice, just behind my ear, murmuring something I couldn't quite make out. I felt a shiver race up my spine as I glanced at Tom, and for a second, I saw the same unease in his eyes. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice echoing oddly in the fog. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, and far too absolute. And then, just like that, the whispering resumed. Louder this time, like multiple voices blending together all around us. They were calling our names, whispering in a broken, distorted way, as if coming from very far away or through water. "Sarah? Tom? Did you hear that?" I whispered, clutching Tom's arm, my pulse pounding. Tom nodded, eyes scanning the fog. "Let's keep moving," he said. "I don't want to just sit here and listen to this." I agreed, though my legs felt like lead. We started walking carefully along the trail, moving in the direction we'd last seen marked. But the voices followed, drifting in and out, growing louder or fading with each step. My stomach twisted with each whisper that grew louder, closer. It was like the fog itself was alive, crowding around us, hemming us in. After what felt like an eternity, Tom froze, stopping so suddenly that I almost stumbled into him. "What?" I whispered. He shook his head, looking over his shoulder. I thought I saw. I don't know. It looked like someone was standing there. We both peered into the mist, but it was as thick as ever, hiding whatever might have been out there. I tried to calm my breathing, telling myself it was just fog, just the usual sounds of the forest. But then the whispering changed. It wasn't calling our names anymore. It was repeating things, words I didn't recognize, and then some that I did. Phrases Tom had said just minutes before. Words that I had whispered to him the night before in our tent. Private, intimate things that no one else should know. Each phrase was spoken back to us in that same broken, eerie voice. I wanted to scream, to break free of whatever strange grip this fog had on us. But all I could do was cling to Tom, feeling my pulse race. The voices grew louder, closing in, until they felt right on top of us, circling us. Don't look, don't look, don't look. That's when Tom turned to me, his face pale. Whatever you do, Sarah, don't turn around. Just keep walking. I didn't question him. I just moved forward, one shaky step at a time, feeling the weight of eyes pressing down on me from every direction. The whispers were insistent now, a chorus of frantic voices repeating over and over, "Don't look back. Don't look back." At some point, the fog finally began to lift. The whispers faded to a faint murmur and then fell silent. I let out a shaky breath and turned to say something to Tom, but he was gone. I called his name, my voice echoing in the trees, but there was nothing, no answer. I walked back and forth along the trail, calling until my throat was raw, but Tom was nowhere. It was as if he'd vanished into the mist itself. In a daze, I stumbled down the trail, desperate, hoping to find him waiting just up ahead, as if this were all some cruel prank. Hours later, I finally made it back to the trailhead, alone, dazed, and terrified. The authorities organized a search, combing the trail and the surrounding woods for days. No sign of him was ever found. Months passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow left part of myself back on that trail, something tied to whatever had whispered to us in the fog. Finally, one weekend, I couldn't resist going back. It was like an invisible pull, calling me to face whatever had happened that day. I hiked back to the same part of the trail where Tom had disappeared. The air was clear, and the forest was peaceful, as if nothing strange had ever happened here. But just as I was about to turn back, something caught my eye, a flash of green hanging from a low branch. It was Tom's backpack. I knew it by the frayed strap and the little patch he'd sewn on himself. The pack was covered in dirt, but it looked untouched, as if someone had carefully placed it there. My heart raced as I reached out to grab it, a faint glimmer of hope flickering through me. But then I saw it. Scrawled in muddy letters across the canvas were the words, "Don't look back." I dropped the backpack, my hands trembling, and stumbled back down the trail, feeling eyes watching me all the way out. To this day, I don't know what we encountered out there, what called to us from that fog. But I've never been back on that trail, and I'll never look back, because I know, somewhere out there, something is still waiting. Fourth story, the mountain sect. I'd been hiking for years, documenting my travels through every trail I could find, but nothing fascinated me quite like the unexplored stretches of the Appalachian Trail. People had whispered about strange happenings in the more remote parts, especially near the old forested mountains in North Carolina. One spot, in particular, kept coming up in hushed conversations, a stretch known to be the former haunt of a reclusive sect from the 1960s. Rumors claimed they practiced rituals deep in the woods, something about calling to the spirits of the mountain. The stories only made me more curious, so I planned a solo trip and set out with my camera gear. The first 2 days were nothing short of mesmerizing. The air was crisp, and the deeper I went, the fewer signs of human life I found. By the end of the second day, I stumbled upon the first sign, carved symbols on a large, moss-covered stone near the trail. The markings were deep and old, and though I didn't recognize the symbols, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I filmed everything, narrating my impressions as I went, hoping the footage would captivate my audience as much as it captivated me. The woods felt different that night. I set up camp near a small clearing, but as I lay in my tent, a strange stillness settled over everything, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a distant, faint chanting that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear more clearly. It was hard to tell the direction, but it was close enough that I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my camera and ventured out of the tent, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Hello," I called, almost hoping no one would answer. Nothing, but the chanting continued, just barely audible. I started filming, sweeping the trees with my light, but I couldn't spot anything out of the ordinary. After a few tense minutes, the chanting stopped abruptly, leaving only the hum of the night insects. Uneasy, I crawled back into my tent and forced myself to sleep, chalking it up to my imagination and nerves. By the third day, I'd found more symbols, carved deep into trees and stones, like an eerie breadcrumb trail leading me deeper into the forest. The closer I got to the heart of this region, the more unsettling the energy became. The air felt thicker, colder, and, inexplicably, my GPS started to glitch, throwing my bearings off by a mile or more at random intervals. I'd never felt so isolated, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was aware of my every step. That night, as I set up my last camp, the chanting returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees. And with it came faint, flickering lights that danced in the distance, like torches moving through the woods. I grabbed my camera, zooming in on the lights, but no matter how much I adjusted the lens, the camera wasn't picking them up. I double-checked my gear, baffled, but the lens showed only black. It was as though the lights were invisible to the camera. By the time I put the camera down, the lights had vanished, and with them the chanting. A creeping dread gnawed at me as I climbed back into my tent, every noise amplified by my fear. I didn't sleep that night, keeping my flashlight and knife close. The final day, I pushed hard to make it back to the main trail, convinced I'd outstayed my welcome. But as I neared a ridge, something stopped me in my tracks. A group of people, 7 or 8 of them, emerged silently from the trees. They were dressed in dark, tattered clothes, their faces shadowed beneath the brims of old hats and hoods. They just stood there, watching me, unmoving, their eyes dull yet fixed on me like they were waiting for something. My heart hammered as I slowly backed away, whispering assurances to myself that I could outrun them if I needed to. But they didn't move. They just stared, their expressions empty. I took one last look at them and turned, bolting down the trail until I was out of sight, my lungs burning from the effort. By the time I reached civilization, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed beyond recognition. I didn't even realize until I got home that I'd left my jacket somewhere in the forest, right near where I'd seen them. When I reviewed the footage later, the chanting and lights weren't there. Not a single sound, not a flicker of movement. It was as if everything I'd experienced had happened in some other dimension. That night, I deleted the video and wiped my entire feed, abandoning my channel. Whatever had happened on that mountain, it wasn't something meant to be shared. Some mysteries, I realized, are better left in the dark. 5th story, The Last Shelter. When Emily disappeared on the Appalachian Trail, it shattered our family. She wasn't just my sister. She was my best friend, my confidant, an experienced hiker. She knew every trick in the book about survival and navigation. So when days turned to weeks, and then to months without a word, I couldn't accept that she'd simply gotten lost. Months passed, and with no sign of her, I finally took matters into my own hands. I packed a bag, grabbed my boots, and set out to trace her steps along the same path. I had no intention of leaving those woods without some kind of answer, whatever it might be. The Appalachian Trail is beautiful, sure, but it can also be unforgiving. Days on end in dense, quiet forests start to mess with your head. Each snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves can feel like someone or something is there, just out of sight. It was easy to see how people could vanish, lose themselves in the silence and shadows. But Emily wouldn't have gotten turned around like that. Something else must have happened. I felt it deep down. On the 5th day, just as the light was beginning to fade, I stumbled upon a small, isolated clearing. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Faint, but off like old campfires and damp soil left undisturbed for too long. Then I saw the trees. Several of them had deep gouges, like claw marks, scratched into the bark. Kneeling down, I spotted bits of broken glass, a torn piece of nylon, and finally, something that made my heart drop: the torn cover of Emily's old journal. It was buried under leaves and dirt, like someone had tried to hide it. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, smudged with mud and some strange, dark stains that might have been from ink or... I didn't want to finish that thought. Her writing grew increasingly frantic, the sentences chopped and unfinished. But one thing became clear. She'd been tracking someone. She called him the Walker. He's following me, one entry read. I feel him there, watching. Every time I stop, I catch glimpses. A shadow, just beyond the tree line. He knows where I'm going, and I think he wants me to stay lost. The next few pages were full of sketches, rough, trembling outlines of trees, hollow eyes, and a tall, faceless figure in the background of each one. My skin prickled. Emily had always been calm, level-headed, and to see her so rattled, so terrified, made me feel sick. The final entry read, "If anyone finds this, know that he's out here. He's been out here a long time. He doesn't want to be found. He wants others to vanish." I don't know how much longer I can keep moving. I barely slept that night, clutching the journal close, hoping to God it was just the ravings of exhaustion and fear. But somewhere I knew better. That morning, I packed up and headed back down the trail, making my way to the nearest ranger station with Emily's journal as my only proof. I went to the police, thinking they'd launch a proper search. But they just took my statement with that look, that patronizing nod, probably thinking I was just another grieving family member unable to let go. They did tell me one thing that stuck. I wasn't the first. Over the years, they'd gotten similar reports. Hikers who claimed to feel followed, stories about glimpsing a figure on the edges of the trail, someone who stayed silent and just out of reach. Each report came from within the same 5-mile stretch, and none of the witnesses ever had proof. Just a gut feeling and a lingering fear. Locals had taken to calling him the Walker. They said he was part of the forest now, something that only appears to those who venture too far or stay too long. Every year now, on the same day Emily disappeared, I returned to that stretch of trail. I've worn a path to that clearing, and I've memorized every scar on those trees, every bit of old nylon, every scratched word in her journal. I'm still hoping for a sign, any sign that will bring her home. But all I ever find is that same empty silence, the same silence that first swallowed her whole. Some say the Walker is just a legend, something to keep people out of the woods. But I know he's there, waiting, watching, patient as the forest itself. 6th story, the mountains whisper. After I left the military, I figured that returning to civilian life would mean finding some peace, a sense of normalcy. But the nightmares, the constant tension, and the memories followed me back like shadows. Therapy helped, but nothing ever fully settled the restlessness in my mind. Then, one day, I decided to confront my demons in a different way. Alone, on the Appalachian Trail. It was supposed to be an escape. Solitude, nature, the raw power of the mountains. I'd convinced myself that something about it would reset me, reconnect me with life outside of those memories. My therapist suggested shorter trips, but I was determined. So, with a backpack and basic gear, I set out, losing myself in the rhythm of the hike, the quiet solitude I'd been craving for months. It was on the fourth day, as I approached a high ridge, that I first noticed it. A thin, chilling breeze that seemed to follow me up the trail. At first, it seemed typical, just the cold air sweeping through the trees. But as I climbed, the breeze didn't let up. It stayed constant, brushing past me like a whisper that I couldn't quite catch. I dismissed it, chalking it up to mountain weather, maybe even my nerves. But it grew louder the higher I went. What had started as an almost musical rustling through the leaves took on an eerie cadence, like something hidden in the air, something trying to form words. And it was just one word, a distorted version of my old nickname from the army, a name only my unit used. The sound drifted through the trees, as if the mountain was calling me. Jay, Jay. I stopped in my tracks, searching around. Nobody was there, just thick forest and miles of rocky terrain. I tried to shake it off, but the breeze didn't stop. It hovered close, like something alive, waiting for me to move again. By the time I reached a small clearing to set up camp, the sun was dipping low, casting long, twisted shadows through the trees. That night, I lay in my tent, listening. The whisper was there, faint at first, barely audible above the wind. But as the night stretched on, it grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like a broken recording. A scratchy, distorted echo of voices I hadn't heard in years. And the words were ones I recognized. The sentences, the fragments of old conversations, they were from my final tour. The things we said on those long, cold nights. It was impossible. How could the mountain know those things? I sat up, clutching my flashlight, breathing hard. The wind swept around the tent, carrying with it the same broken whispers. Jay, stay low, stay alert. My hands were shaking. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, just my mind, or even the altitude playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the sounds were too specific, too close to memories I tried every day to forget. I had to see what was out there. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, letting the cold air hit me as I scanned the clearing with my flashlight. Nothing, just the skeletal trees and the vast emptiness of the mountain. But the whisper grew louder, surrounding me, and then, just as clearly as if they were standing beside me, I heard voices. My unit's voices. I knew the phrases, the rhythm of our late-night banter, the clipped sentences from those tense nights on patrol. They sounded so real, like they were right there with me, coming from somewhere deep within the forest. My legs went numb, and I staggered backward, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The next morning, I broke camp and practically ran back down the trail, my mind reeling. I couldn't explain it. Even when I reached the base of the mountain, the wind seemed to tug at me, carrying that same chilling whisper, but weaker now, fading as I left. I got in my truck and drove, not stopping until I'd reached town. When I finally calmed down, I told my therapist everything. But what could he say? He suggested it was a projection of my trauma, an auditory hallucination brought on by stress. I almost believed him, almost, but the memories haunted me, creeping back in fragments, like the voices had embedded themselves deeper into my mind. Years later, I heard another vet talk about that part of the trail, mentioning whispers he'd heard while hiking there alone. I could see it in his eyes, the same haunted look, the same dark familiarity. Other veterans, people who'd seen things, heard things they couldn't forget, had heard it too. It's as if the mountain kept a record of our trauma, echoing it back to us in broken, chilling whispers, a living reminder of things I wished I could bury. And now, every time the wind blows, I wonder if it's the same mountain breeze, calling my name, waiting for me to return. Seventh story, The Invisible City. It was Carol's idea to take on the Corridor of Perdition. She'd read about it online, a section of the Appalachian Trail that hardly anyone documented and was steeped in old local legends. Rumor had it there was a ghost town hidden somewhere in that stretch, an invisible city that would only appear for those who truly believed in it. We'd hiked together for years, always chasing that next thrill. So the idea of a hidden city sounded too good to pass up. The day started off clear and bright, the trees blazing with the last colors of fall. The trail was rugged and overgrown, as though even nature wanted to keep people out. We had maps, but they were sketchy at best. The corridor of perdition wasn't exactly marked on any official trails. Still, we were prepared and excited, laughing off the warnings from the few hikers we'd met along the way who'd given us knowing, almost pitying looks when we'd mentioned where we were headed. We were deep in the woods when things started to feel wrong. There was a strange symmetry to the forest around us. Stones and sticks lay in oddly organized patterns along the path, forming small rings and lines that almost looked deliberate. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being led somewhere. "Look, over there," Carol whispered, pointing off the trail. Through a thick patch of trees, we saw what looked like an old foundation. Rectangular, moss-covered stones arranged in a perfect outline, as if they'd once supported a building. "Maybe it's the start of the town," I said, my heart pounding with excitement. But as we approached, an intense wave of dizziness hit me. It was sudden and powerful, like stepping off a spinning ride. I had to steady myself against a tree. "You okay?" Carol asked, though I could see she looked pale herself. She rubbed her temples and shook her head, probably feeling the same strange vertigo. "Yeah, let's keep going," I managed, shrugging it off. As we walked deeper, the forest seemed to shift. More stone formations appeared, some just clusters, others arranged in lines as if marking out streets or pathways. We passed what looked like an old wooden post, weathered and rotting, barely recognizable. And that feeling, that eerie sense of déjà vu crept in, as if I'd been here before, though I knew I hadn't. It was subtle at first, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, but it grew stronger with every step. After what felt like hours, we emerged into a large, open space covered in moss and dead leaves. There, standing in eerie silence, were the remains of what looked like buildings. Stone walls rose waist-high, their edges softened by years of moss and vines. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, as though nature had reclaimed this place long ago. "This has to be it," I whispered, awestruck. We found the city, but as soon as I said it, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. The silence was thick, pressing in on us like a weight. Felt watched. Carol seemed to sense it too. She kept looking over her shoulder, eyes wide. That's when we heard the footsteps, light, almost playful, moving in quick, darting steps around us. I spun, trying to catch a glimpse, but there was no one there, just the empty, decayed ruins and the trees that seemed to loom closer every time I looked away. "We need to go," Carol whispered, grabbing my arm. Her voice was trembling, and for the first time, I felt a real surge of fear. We started to retrace our steps, but every path looked the same. We tried taking different turns, doubling back, but somehow we always ended up right back in that clearing. The ruins seemed to pulse with each failed attempt, like they were drawing us in, refusing to let us go. Panic set in as the sky began to darken, casting long shadows across the broken stones. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the city was alive, like it was waiting for something. Finally, as the last light faded, we stumbled upon a familiar section of trail, the one we'd started on hours before. Without another word, we bolted, not stopping until we reached the road and could see the distant lights of our parked car. We drove in silence, neither of us willing to talk about what had just happened. Back in town, we tried to report what we'd seen, but the rangers dismissed us. They insisted there were no records of any settlements in that area, no hidden city as we described. They treated us like two thrill-seekers who'd let their imaginations get the best of them. We left the station embarrassed, but deep down, I knew what we'd seen was real. Over the next few weeks, things only got stranger. Both Carol and I began having vivid, unsettling dreams of that city. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the ruins lingering in my mind, feeling like they were calling me back. Carol confessed that she'd been experiencing episodes of sleepwalking. She'd wake up by her door, hand on the knob as if ready to leave. Sometimes, she'd find herself halfway down the street in the dead of night, barefoot, her face blank and confused. It wasn't long before I started experiencing the same thing. I'd wake up standing in my living room, reaching for my hiking boots. Each time, the urge to return to that place grew stronger, like the city was pulling me back, inch by inch. It's been months now, and neither of us has dared return to the corridor of perdition. But the dreams continue, and the sleepwalking gets worse. Every night, I feel the pull, stronger and more insistent. I don't know what's waiting for us back there, hidden in the fog and ruins, but I'm terrified that one night, I won't be able to resist. And when I do go back, I don't think I'll come out.